The room was full of gold, lights, and laughter. But behind the shining curtain stood a girl who never smiled. Her name was Lisari. She had silver skin, soft purple eyes, and long white hair that touched the floor. Jewels hung from her neck and arms, and her clothes were made of the finest silks in the galaxy. To many, she looked like a queen. But she was not a queen. She was a personal slave, owned by Lord Varnack, a powerful alien merchant. He never hit her, never shouted, but he never let her be free. Lisari was trained to serve him in every way, to be quiet, beautiful, and obedient. She wasn't allowed to talk unless asked. And she couldn't leave her room without permission. She lived in a cage made of silk and diamonds, and everyone clapped when they saw her, never knowing or caring how much she wanted to run away. That day, a trade gathering was held in the capital dome of Ceres 9. Leaders from many planets came to make deals, show power, and drink fine alien wines. Among them was one human, a man named Daniel Burke. He was not a soldier, not a diplomat, just a traveler whose ship had broken down. He had come hoping to find help or parts, maybe some work, but the room fell silent when the others saw him. A human? Here, on Ceres 9? They laughed quietly and whispered to each other. Humans were considered weak, forgotten, nearly extinct after losing most of their colonies in the last galactic war. Daniel ignored the whispers. He walked in with calm steps, wearing a plain jacket and carrying nothing but a bag of old tools. Lord Varnack saw him, and something cruel lit in his eyes. He stood up and clapped loudly, calling attention. "Friends," he said with a grin. "Let's have some fun." He snapped his fingers, and the silk curtains opened. Lisari stepped out slowly, her head down, her hands folded in front of her. "She is my finest companion," Varnack said proudly. "Perfect in every way." The crowd cheered. Daniel looked at her, and then looked again. She wasn't smiling. She looked tired, lost, like a bird with broken wings. "She's more than what she seems," Varnack said, walking over to Daniel. "Your ship is broken, yes? I'll fix it for free," he laughed. "And in return, take her." People gasped and laughed. Let's see what the human does with a real gift. One alien chuckled. Everyone thought Daniel would jump at the offer. After all, Lisari was priceless, and humans were desperate for companionship. But Daniel didn't smile. He looked at Lisari again, then turned to Varnack and said, "Is she free to speak?" The room went quiet. Varnack raised an eyebrow. "She doesn't need to speak." Daniel stepped forward and gently asked Lisari, "Do you want to leave with me?" She didn't know how to answer. No one had ever asked her what she wanted. Her lips moved, but no words came out. The silence stretched. Daniel looked at Varnack again. "I'll take the deal," he said firmly. Varnack laughed, clapped his hands, and waved the crowd away. Later, outside the dome, Daniel stood beside his small broken ship. Lisari stood a few feet away, not moving, not speaking. "You can go," he said softly. "You don't belong to anyone now." She stared at him like he spoke a different language. "You don't want anything?" She finally asked, her voice almost a whisper. "I just wanted to get you out of there." Daniel said, "That place wasn't right." Still, she didn't move. "Come inside," he said after a moment. "It's cold out here," she followed him in, still quiet, still unsure. The inside of his ship was small, messy, and smelled of old machine oil, but it was warm. He gave her a blanket and sat on the floor to check his tools. "You don't have to serve me," he said without looking up. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Because I'm not your owner," he replied. "You're not a thing." Lisari sat down in the corner and watched him. He was strange, this human. He didn't ask her to kneel, to smile, or to dance. He didn't even stare at her beauty like others did. He just worked, quietly, like a normal person. For the first time in her life, Lisari didn't feel afraid. She didn't know it yet, but her life had already changed. The silk cage was gone, and the stars had opened a new path in front of her. Lisari sat on the cold floor of the human ship. The blanket still wrapped around her like a second skin. She had not slept. Not because she wasn't tired, but because she didn't feel safe. Not from danger, but from confusion. No master had ever said the things Daniel said. No master had ever walked away after giving her a command, because Daniel didn't give commands. And that was the strangest part of all. The engines made soft humming noises, the kind she used to hear far away through palace windows. Now they were close. Too close and too real. She watched Daniel move around the ship's control room, checking wires, tools, monitors. He hadn't spoken to her since they left Ceres 9. He gave her space, not orders. She hated that she didn't know what to do. "Should I clean?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Daniel looked over his shoulder. Surprised. "You don't have to," he said gently. "Just rest if you want." She nodded but didn't move. Her heart raced. The silence felt too large, like a room with no walls. Freedom. She had heard that word before, but only as a warning. Freedom is dangerous. Freedom is chaos. Freedom means being alone. That's what the other slaves whispered in dark corners when no one listened. And now she was here, alone with freedom and a man who didn't touch her, didn't ask anything of her. It terrified her more than chains later. Daniel came back with some dry food and a cup of warm liquid. He placed it beside her without a word. She stared at it, unsure if it was a trick. He didn't force her to eat, just walked away and sat near the engine room door, resting his back against the wall. After a few minutes, she picked up the cup, sniffed it, and took a sip. Her eyes widened. It was sweet, a kind of cocoa, the first real comfort she had tasted in years. She finished it slowly, looking at him from the corner of her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Daniel opened one eye and said, "Because it's the right thing." She didn't understand that answer, not fully, but something warm touched her chest, something small and strange. Hope. That night, she lay on the floor near the wall, wrapped in her blanket. Daniel had taken the cot and offered her the bed, but she refused. The cot was familiar, the floor safer. When the lights dimmed, her memories returned like shadows. Varnick's eyes, the gold cage, the silence she had learned to survive in. But this ship made a different kind of silence. A calm silence, not a cruel one. In the morning, Daniel was already awake, fixing the broken thrusters outside the ship. Lisari stood near the doorway, watching him work. He had grease on his face and wires in both hands. He didn't look like a hero. He didn't even look strong, but she realized something. He looked kind. That was a word she had never trusted before. Kindness had always come with a price. Daniel didn't ask for a price. Later that day, he asked her, "Can you hold this wire?" She hesitated, but stepped forward. She held the wire with shaking hands while he adjusted a part. "Thanks," he said casually, just one word. But it made her feel something new, useful. "I used to help fix machines," she said without thinking. Daniel turned to her, eyebrows raised. "Really?" "Yes," she nodded. "Before the palace, you were an engineer?" She looked down, unsure. "I used to fix things in the lower quarters, small things. Lights, heaters, water tubes." Daniel smiled. "Then you're already better than me." She blinked. "What?" "I just make things work long enough not to explode," he said with a laugh. She didn't laugh, but her lips curved just a little. It wasn't much, but it was her first real smile. The two worked together the rest of the day. She didn't ask for permission anymore. She simply acted, and when the engine finally hummed to life, Daniel raised his hand for a high five. Lisari just stared at it, unsure what to do. He smiled and gently tapped her hand with his. "Good job," he said. Her heart skipped again. Later that night, when they shared more cocoa in the quiet cabin, Lisari looked at him and asked, "Do humans treat everyone like this?" "Not all," he said honestly, "but we try." She nodded, then whispered, "I think I want to try too." Daniel looked at her, curious. "Try what?" "To learn who I am," she said, slowly. "Not what I was made to be." And in that small ship, floating in the dark stars, A girl who had lived her whole life in a golden cage began her journey not as a slave, not as property, but as a person. The stars outside the window looked peaceful, but inside Daniel's ship, nothing felt peaceful anymore. Lissari had just finished checking the coolant levels when a sharp beeping filled the cockpit. Daniel rushed forward, his eyes scanning the red flashing alert on the screen. "What is it?" Lissari asked, walking closer. He didn't answer at first. Then he said quietly, "We've been tagged." She froze. "Tagged?" "A bounty signal," Daniel said. "Encrypted, but I know who sent it." Her heart dropped. "Varnak," Daniel nodded. "He wants you back." Lissari stepped back, shaking. Her breath turned sharp, and old fear wrapped around her again, like cold chains. "He won't stop," she whispered. "He'll keep hunting me. Then we don't let him find you." Daniel said calmly, "We move." He pushed a few buttons, adjusting the ship's course. Their new destination, the black market station called Driftpoint 17, a place where ships disappeared and no one asked questions. The journey would take a full day through asteroid fields and shadow zones. Lissari sat in the co-pilot seat, hands shaking as she tried to control her fear. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly. Daniel looked over, confused. "For what?" "For making trouble." He shook his head. "You didn't make trouble. You were in trouble. There's a difference." She didn't reply, but deep inside, the words touched her. Still, the weight of her past was heavy. In her mind, Varnak's voice echoed, "You're mine forever. You're nothing without me." At Driftpoint 17, the station looked like a metal skeleton floating in space. Rusty ships drifted around it like vultures. Inside, the air smelled like oil and smoke, and the lights flickered as if they were afraid to stay on. Daniel walked through the crowd with Lissari at his side. She wore a simple cloak, the hood hiding her silver hair and eyes. But even hidden, her posture was different now, not like a slave, but not yet free. Somewhere in between, Daniel met with a contact, a four-armed mechanic named Ruse. Ruse grinned when he saw the human. "Still flying that junk pile, Burke?" Daniel smiled. "Still charging double for weak shields, Ruse?" They laughed, but the laughter didn't last. When Ruse looked at Lissari, his eyes narrowed. "She's not just a passenger." Daniel said nothing. "You should get off this station fast," Ruse warned. "Word is, someone's paying big money for a girl that looks like her." Lissari lowered her head. Daniel placed a hand on her back and said, "We're leaving tonight." But the warning had come too late. They were followed, not openly, just the feeling of eyes. Whispers, shadows that moved too quickly. Back at the ship, Lissari finally said, "I don't want to keep running." Daniel looked at her. "Then we stop." She blinked, unsure. "How?" "By showing them you're not someone they can own." He said, "Not anymore." That night, when the bounty hunters arrived, they didn't find a scared girl hiding. They found Lissari standing at the top of the loading ramp, eyes steady, voice calm. "This is your last warning," she said. "Leave or you'll regret it." The hunters laughed. Then the ship's defense turret fired, melting a hole in the floor near their boots. Daniel stepped out with a plasma pistol, calm but firm. "You heard her." The hunters backed off, muttering curses. When they were gone, Lissari sat on the ramp steps and let out a long breath. Daniel sat beside her. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. "That was the first time I ever told someone no," he smiled. "Felt good?" She looked at her hands, felt real. They sat together under the stars, the air between them quiet but full, not with fear, but with something stronger, trust, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something more. Driftpoint 17 faded behind them, swallowed by the cold of space. The stars outside blinked slowly, like old eyes watching, inside the ship. Everything felt calm, but underneath that calm, something heavy moved. Daniel worked at the controls in silence, and Lissari sat across from him, watching. She had changed. Even she could feel it. The girl who once feared her own voice had now stood face to face with danger and refused to kneel. But freedom wasn't simple. It came with questions. Who was she now? What did she want? Could she ever truly belong anywhere? The ship flew through a deep space corridor. Far from trade routes or known planets, it was safer but darker out here. There were no rescue signals, no lights from nearby colonies, just stars and silence. Suddenly, all power on the ship went out. Lights flickered, then vanished. Engines slowed to nothing. Silence fell like a stone. Lisari stood up fast, panic rising in her chest. She was back in the dark. Back in the cage, back in the cold rooms where she had no voice and no name. Daniel? She called, her voice shaking. He didn't answer. Daniel! She said louder, her breath growing shorter. Footsteps moved near her slow. Heavy ones. She turned fast, heart racing, only to feel a hand gently touch hers. "It's me," Daniel said, his voice calm. "It's just a power drop." His fingers wrapped around hers. Firm but gentle. "You're safe." Lisari held his hand tightly, breathing hard. Her skin felt hot and cold at the same time. She didn't want to speak, but the words fell out. "I used to be locked in the dark," she whispered. "For hours. Sometimes days." Daniel didn't say anything. He just sat down beside her, still holding her hand. "You're not there anymore," he said softly. "And you never will be again." The emergency lights kicked in, casting a soft red glow around them, but Lisari didn't move away. She looked at their hands still joined, and something inside her broke open, not in pain, but in relief. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Trembling, "I keep thinking it's not real," she said. "That you'll change, that you'll want something from me." "I won't," he replied. "You don't owe me anything." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was full of something new, warmth. He didn't hold her like she was fragile, or like she was a prize. He held her like someone who mattered. The lights returned fully a few minutes later, and Daniel stood up to check the engine. Lisari remained seated, her heart still beating fast, but in a different way now. For the first time, she didn't feel like a thing. She felt human that night. She couldn't sleep. She walked quietly through the ship, touching the walls, the doors, the controls. Not as a slave, but as someone trying to understand her place. She ended up in the engine room, where Daniel was wiping oil from a filter. He looked up and smiled. "Can't sleep?" She shook her head. "I wanted to ask something." "Sure," he said, sitting down. "Why did you take me that day?" She asked. "You could have said no." Daniel paused, then answered, "Because I saw someone who didn't belong in a cage." She frowned slightly. "But you didn't even know me." "I didn't need to," he said. "I just knew no one else would help you." Lisari sat beside him on the floor, knees pulled close to her chest. "I'm still learning how to be free," she said. "Sometimes I feel like I'm faking it." "You're not," he said gently. "You're doing better than you think." She looked at him, really looked. His face had lines of tiredness. His eyes held old memories. Maybe he carried his own kind of pain. And yet, he still chose kindness, still chose her. They sat in the hum of the engine for a long time, no words needed. Then, just before leaving, Lisari reached out again, this time not in fear. She touched his hand first. Daniel looked at her, surprised, then smiled, a real smile, not forced, not polite, just warm and human. And for once, Lisari smiled back without fear. The ship landed gently on the green-blue moon of Terran Minor. It was quiet, far from the eyes of the merchant lords, far from the reach of Varnak's bounty hunters. A place where laws were simple, and names didn't matter. Daniel stepped out first, checking the air and scanning for signals. Lisari followed slowly, her boots pressing into soft earth for the first time in years. There was no metal beneath her feet, no cage around her body, just open land, gentle wind and sky. For a moment, she closed her eyes and breathed. It smelled of trees, of water, of something real. "This place is safe," Daniel said. "You could live here if you wanted." Lisari looked at him, unsure. "You mean, without you?" He nodded. "You don't owe me anything. You're free to choose where you go." The words should have made her happy, but instead they confused her. Her heart twisted strangely. "I thought we were staying together," she said. Softly, Daniel paused. Only if you want that. She didn't answer, not yet. They walked through this small human colony that welcomed travelers with simple meals and quiet respect. No one stared at her, no one whispered. People here were used to different faces, different stories. A woman with red hair even offered lisari. Some fruit, smiling without judgment. It felt strange being treated like a person. That night, the town gave them a small guest hut near the lake. Lisari couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching stars flicker on the water's surface. Daniel sat behind her, fixing a cracked panel on his ship's comms unit. He didn't speak, just let her think, and she needed to think for so long. Others had made decisions for her. Where to sleep, what to wear, what to feel. Even when she had escaped with Daniel, she had followed him because he was different. But tonight, she realized she didn't want to follow anymore. She wanted to walk beside him, not behind. She stood up and walked outside without a word. The wind was cold against her face, but it helped clear her mind. A small wooden bridge crossed the river. Near the hut, she walked to its center and stopped. Staring at the flowing water below, it reminded her of herself, always moving, always afraid to stop. Daniel's footsteps came behind her. But he didn't speak, he just waited. Finally, Lisari turned around, looked into his eyes and said, "I want to stay with you." Daniel raised his eyebrows, surprised. "But not because I feel I have to," she added quickly. "I choose this," she said with strength. "I choose you." Daniel didn't speak right away. He stepped closer and asked gently, "Are you sure?" She nodded. "You gave me freedom, and now I want to use that freedom to stay." There was silence between them, but it was the kind that felt full, not empty. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. This time not in fear, not in weakness, but as an equal. Daniel smiled, a little overwhelmed, but happy. "Then I'd be honored," he said. They stood together on the bridge. The stars above, the river below, and the past behind them. Back at the hut, Lisari did something small but bold. She sat at the same table as Daniel, not lower, not beside, just across. When he offered her some food, she took it with a soft smile. She was learning to accept kindness without fear. When she laughed at one of his small jokes, he stared at her like she had just given him a gift. That night, before sleeping, she asked him, "What would it mean to be your partner, your mate?" Daniel paused, surprised. "It would mean we walk life together. Not one leading the other, but side by side." Lisari thought about that, then whispered, "That's what I want." And for the first time since her escape, she didn't dream of cages or darkness or chains. She dreamed of stars. And a hand reaching out to hold hers. Not to pull her, but to walk forward together. Asterisk. The moon of Terran Manor was peaceful, too peaceful. Lisari woke to a strange feeling. Not from a nightmare, but from a chill running through her skin outside. The stars seemed dimmer, as if something had covered the sky. She walked to the small window of their hut and froze. There, at the far edge of the field, stood a large black ship. Not just any ship, his ship. Varnak. Her body trembled. Her fingers gripped the windowsill. For a long moment, she didn't breathe. Then she turned, ran to the back room where Daniel was packing tools. "He's here," she said quietly. Daniel's face hardened. "How did he find us?" "I don't know," Lisari whispered. "But I know what he wants." Daniel nodded, walking past her to grab the emergency weapon case. Outside, the black ship opened, and a group of armored soldiers stepped out in perfect formation. Behind them walked Varnak, his skin gleaming like oil, his smile wide and fake. "I've come to collect what's mine," he announced to the crowd of confused colonists. People backed away, unsure, scared. Varnak's voice echoed across the clearing. "Lisari, come now, and no one has to suffer." Daniel stepped forward, standing between Varnak and the hut. "She's not yours," he said firmly. "She was never yours." Varnak raised one eyebrow, amused. "She's a slave. A personal property, gifted under law." "She's a person," Daniel snapped. "And she chooses her own life now." Varnak's eyes darkened. You really think a piece of property can choose?" Before Daniel could answer, another voice rang out, soft but strong. "She can." It was Lissari. She stepped out of the hut, head held high, cloak falling behind her like wings. She walked past Daniel, past the colonists, and stopped just a few steps from her old master. People gasped, waiting for her to break, to kneel, to obey. But she didn't. "I'm not yours," she said, clear and strong. "I was never yours," Varnek laughed, but it was sharp, angry. "You think one human changes what you are?" "No," she said, "but I do." A tense silence followed. Then Varnik motioned to his guards. "Take her." The guards stepped forward, weapons in hand. But something unexpected happened. The colonists' men, women, and even a few children stood up, moving between Lissari and the soldiers. One man raised a tool, another held a shovel. They didn't have weapons, but they had numbers, and behind them stood Daniel, holding a plasma rifle steady. "You'll have to go through all of us," he said coldly. Varnek looked around, realizing he was no longer in control. His eyes met Lissari's one last time, full of rage and disbelief. "This isn't over," he hissed. "No," she said. "It's just beginning." He turned, snapped his fingers, and his troops marched back to the ship. The black ship lifted into the sky, leaving a burning trail behind, but not a single word of victory, only silence. The crowd slowly relaxed. But Lissari remained still, watching the skies. Daniel walked up beside her, not touching, just being. "There. You didn't run," he said softly. "No," she replied, "and I never will again." Later that evening, the colony leaders met and offered help. They called for a legal hearing under human law to decide her fate once and for all, for the first time. Lissari stood in front of a room, not to be judged, not to be sold, but to speak. She told them everything. The palace, the cage, the silence, the escape, and the man who never asked for anything but gave her everything. When she finished, the room was silent. Then one of the council members said, "Do you want to file for identity and rights as a free person?" Lissari nodded, slowly but surely. "I want to live," she said. "Truly live." Daniel smiled at her from the back of the room, pride shining in his eyes, and this time, she didn't feel like someone saved. She felt like someone who had saved herself. The courtroom doors opened with a soft hiss. Lissari walked out, shoulders straight, eyes clear. People stood on both sides, silent at first, then slowly clapping not out of duty, but respect, behind her. The council's final decision had been made. She was no longer property, no longer a gift, no longer a shadow in someone else's story. She had a name now, a name she had chosen for herself. Lissari Burke. She had asked Daniel if she could take it, and he had paused, surprised, hooked. Then, with a smile and a nod, he said, "Only if you truly want it." And she had, not because it belonged to him, but because it now belonged to them, together. That evening, the colony gathered to celebrate, not just her legal freedom, but the courage it had taken to stand up and claim it. Lights glowed across the trees. Music echoed gently through the open field. Lissari wore a simple white dress, nothing like the jeweled silks of her past. It was soft, light, and free, just like her. Daniel stood near the small river where they had first walked together, his clothes clean but plain. He looked nervous, maybe even more than when he had faced bounty hunters. When Lissari approached, everyone turned, waiting. There was no stage, no grand speaker, just two people standing together, under the stars. "I never thought I'd see this day," Lissari said, her voice soft but steady. "I never thought I'd be anyone. But then you showed me I could be more than what others said." Daniel took her hands, eyes steady. "And you showed me what it means to care," he replied. "Not because of who someone was, but because of who they can become." There were no long speeches, no rings, just a simple promise, shared between them, spoken not just with words, but with eyes, smiles, and silence. When Daniel leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently to hers, the crowd didn't cheer. They simply stood quietly, witnessing a moment that didn't need noise to be powerful. Later, as the night grew calm, Lasari sat with Daniel on the hill above the river. The stars stretched across the sky like soft paint. "I used to dream of escape," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "But I never dreamed I'd find someone who would walk beside me after." "You're not walking behind anyone now," Daniel said with a quiet laugh. "You're walking ahead half the time." She smiled. "Maybe that's true." There was a long silence, not empty but full of meaning. Then Daniel asked, "What now?" Lasari thought for a moment, watching the stars blink like memories. "I want to help others like me," she said. "There are still cages out there. Maybe not all made of gold, but cages all the same." Daniel nodded. "We can do that." "We?" she asked with a small grin. "Always," he said, taking her hand. Her fingers closed around his gently. Not with fear, not with doubt, but with strength. She wasn't a prisoner anymore. She wasn't a thing, a symbol, or a secret. She was a voice, a choice, a woman who had walked out of a golden cage and into her own life. And she had chosen love, not because she needed it, but because she was finally free to choose anything, and she chose him.